Sorry, technology not working. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for missing the wonderful sunshine outside and joining us in this wonderful theater for our panel. Most of you at this point will probably be sick of hearing about AI at this point, and I'm quite sorry to add another panel to the list, but we'll try and make it exciting and fun, and then afterwards you can enjoy some more aperitivos or coffees and the rest of Perugia. Just briefly on what we're going to do. We basically want to focus on one simple question. How do we make sure as news organizations that we are not vibing our way to utopia when it comes to AI? This is sort of our panel in a nutshell. In slightly longer words, I would say is how do we systematically assess the fitness of AI systems for various journalistic applications, and how do we know that this stuff works, and for what, and also when it does not work. This is sort of one of the themes we sort of came back to in our conversations over the last year. We thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to have that as a panel in Perugia? And thanks to Chris, Ariane, and the team, we're now here, and look forward to discussing this with you. Just a quick overview of the panel itself. We will start with super short introductions and some examples to ground our discussion. And I will then interrogate in a friendly manner my fellow panelists on how they have approached the evaluation of AI systems in those contexts. And we will then end with a quick round of advice, lessons, and then go over to short audience Q&A. For the Q&A, I'll just say it from the start, I will be taking questions in probably pairs of threes, and I would ask you to keep them brief because we won't have a lot of time. But yeah, without further ado, let's do the introduction. Let's start with Tess to my right and then go towards Chris.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tess Jeffers. I am the Director of Newsroom Data and AI at the Wall Street Journal. I joined the Journal in 2019 as a data scientist. I now lead the team of newsroom data scientists and data analysts, mostly working on editorial analytics. But 9 months ago, we added editorial AI initiatives to our roles as well. And in broad strokes, what we work on are three things. We work on standards and governance. We work on training and upskilling the newsroom on these new AI tools. And we work in a bridge role, product and program coordination almost, between the newsroom and our tech and product team that sits centralized in our parent company.
Hello, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. My name is Rubina Medan-Filian, and I'm the Associate Editorial Director of AI Initiatives at the New York Times. And what that means is that I'm part of a cross-functional team that includes editors, a product designer, and 2 machine learning engineers. And we work on 3 things as well. One of them is reporting powers, basically being able to expand them by helping journalists work with very large troves of data, documents, video or audio, and being able to find the needles in haystacks to make their reporting much more effective and be able to tell stories that we wouldn't be able to tell without the use of AI. The second is production assistance, so that's mainly around helping journalists with their editorial workflows, and that's most of what I'll be talking about today, but it is not our primary focus. And the third is reader experiences. So an example of that is just ways to make our journalism more accessible to more people. So that includes things like text-to-speech, which is when you are able to listen to an article rather than just read it. That makes it possible not just to help visually impaired people, but those who are able to process information better through audio. And also translation, being able to make our journalism more accessible by simply reaching people who are not English speakers around the world. So we've been able to use AI for all of these things.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Moran. I'm the head of editorial innovation at The Guardian. I started at The Guardian about 200 or 300 years ago now. I spent 10 years as a freelance sub-editor and production assistant. I became The Guardian's first audience editor and built the kind of culture and processes around that team and the tooling around it. And through doing that, I moved more and more towards a very similar kind of editorial product bridge role, as well as carrying out large kind of cultural shifts in The Guardian, like content reduction. How do we, or should we, write less journalism? For the last 2.5 years, my role has been pretty much entirely AI focused. Like the other members of the panel, a lot of that is about trying to understand what fits well into our particular newsroom. but it has also been right across the top of principles, thinking about copyright, and all of the enormous kind of ecosystem questions that come with this. And right now, I think the thing that occupies my mind is in some ways less what we are going to build ourselves, just in terms of what's interesting, and more considering the disruption that is coming at us through the ecosystem right now in terms of intermediation. How do we need to change our whole product to demonstrate the value that we can bring in contrast to some of these tools?
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'm super excited to be on the stage with you all. And I'd say let's start with a few examples. I asked each of you sort of for the panel to talk about one thing that you've done that we can then sort of look at a bit more closely. So probably let's just again start with Tess and tell us about the sort of one AI examples in your organization that would be sort of helpful to the discussion.
I brought 2 examples, if that's okay.
Nice.
I wanted to talk a little bit about our summary bullet points, which I'm sure many people in the room have already seen, implemented, or experimented with. We launched ours about 6 months ago due to a client request from our B2B, our newswires consumers. And it was mentioned on a panel earlier that these are now table stakes. So 100%, if a client is asking you for it, that means it's a table stakes request. So that's one good reason to work on it, but another was that we wanted to understand better how do our traditional news consumers on our website, do summaries play a role in how they consume and their habits with the news? And this was going to be our first Gen AI tool plugged directly into our CMS, so a lot to learn in that workflow itself. The other example, if we can talk through it, we just launched Lars. He is our AI tax bot. He can help you answer all of your questions about filing your US taxes. You have a few more days, if you're in the US, to ask Lars any of your questions. And so the point there is that we have a number of reporters who cover taxes, everything from tax policy to how to file your taxes. They write guides, and every time they write one of these articles, they get hundreds and hundreds of questions with very specific and very personal details. We obviously can't answer all of those, but AI can. This is a great application to get really personal, custom answers. So Lars is a RAG model. He's grounded in over 1,200 articles from the Wall Street Journal over the past few years, and also grounded in public documents from the IRS. So the motivation is to better leverage our archives, super serve our audience in this lane of coverage that we absolutely want to own.
So when I started on the AI initiatives team at the Times, I've spent a lot of time talking individually to journalists, and so did my colleagues. And I ended up starting a newsroom generative AI pilot, which had about 100 journalists from across the newsroom and opinion from all different departments. And what we really wanted to find out is how they would use generative AI, which use cases they would come up with. And so we spent 2 months working with them. I had focus groups with them. I had demos, surveys. We had a very active Slack channel where they could ask questions, and I developed resources for them and trainings. And really what we were curious about is how would they use AI? And I think it's really important to be able to ask editors and reporters that directly and have it be kind of a bottom-up approach as to how you're thinking about your AI strategy. And so from this pilot that we spent 2 months on, one thing that came out of it, and also from many, many one-on-one conversations and group conversations, was that about 2/3 of the requests and frustrations that we were hearing about had something to do with summarization. So basically, summarization is very broad. You might be thinking of the bullet point example, which many newsrooms have adopted. But it's really a lot of the things that editors have to do before a story is published or to promote a story. So it could be something like the headline, for example, the deck, kind of like the sub-summary of it, the SEO headlines. It could be the bullets that come up in newsletters. It could be the last few minutes of a podcast where they say, this is the news you're missing today, and here's a very brief summary of other articles. It could be even a news quiz that's kind of asking questions around a particular topic. So we wanted to figure out a way to help journalists be able to come up with these summaries themselves and actually come up with the use cases themselves. So my colleague, Zui Wen, came up with this brilliant idea. He's a machine learning engineer, to basically create something called Echo that would take any New York Times URL, so an article, a live asset, an interactive, even a Wirecutter piece or an athletic piece, and be able to summarize it in whatever way the journalist wanted. So we would have an interface that included a list of articles, the article they were looking at, and then they could either choose a preset prompt that we had written, or they could enter in their own prompt that would allow them to basically take the information in the article and put it into another form. I want to make it really clear that we do not use AI to write articles, but we have started to think about how we could use it downstream of articles to be able to adapt it. And Echo is an extremely flexible tool for journalists to use, and we have been incredibly interested in how they would use it. And we started collaborating with them on all of these different types of summaries, which could really amount to dozens of different use cases.
So the example I'm bringing is something which we didn't deploy. About 18 months ago, we really wanted to get a sense of what fine-tuning involved and what the possible outcomes of it might be. We didn't want to give it something particularly easy. We wanted to give it something we thought it might fail at, and it did, to a certain extent. And the use case was, I think, a really good one, right? So it's for live blog summaries. So most people who run live blogs have the same thing. Every 4 hours or so, your live blogger probably has to stop for a 20-minute period where they rewrite a summary of what has happened over the previous 4 hours. And of course, the use case for that is there are many people who are landing in the middle of a live blog with not enough context about where we are now. So the idea is this will help them catch up or provide an anchor point. The idea was, ideally, we don't want those live bloggers having to do that. It would be great if they could continue to focus on what was actually happening. They're in a very time-poor environment, so any saving is a good one. And the idea was kind of twofold. If it worked, the first step would be, let's just serve that to the live blog editor so they can quickly scan it and drop it in, make any edits they need to. But obviously, even better than that, if they were reliable, you could imagine a situation in which you actually leave that in the hands of the reader. For the moment they arrive at the live blog, they press the button and it catches them up to exactly that point. So as I say, we were pretty convinced it wouldn't be able to do this, but we wanted to give it something ambitious just to see how it worked.
Terrific. So a broad range of super interesting examples, all of them doing interesting things, even though in the live blog case that didn't work. Now I think we said we were going to talk about evaluation. How did you think about defining and evaluating success in all these three cases? So when you think of things like metrics and markers for success, the evaluation pipelines that you developed, but probably also the difficulties along the way, how did this process come about, and how did you actually define what good looks like, and how did you measure that in the end? Because in many ways, we know a lot of times we sort of talk about AI and we sort of think like, well, we just use it and then it's going to make things better. But you're all very seasoned pros, you know that's not how it's working in practice. So I'd be very curious to hear how you thought about this process. And maybe, Chris, if you want to start, and then we'll just move back.
Sure. So I think the thing that we learn most about fine-tuning is it takes a hell of a lot of human grunt, right? Which, I mean, 18 months down the line, maybe that's a bit better known, but at that point we weren't entirely certain about how much effort it took. So the very first thing we had to do was select around about 3,700 live blogs from about 25 very different kinds of tones and topics that we thought of as good examples for the machine to take in, right? And then you hit the point where, yeah, you go, okay, how the hell do we evaluate this, right? And the first thing we thought about was, well, maybe actually what we do is we give this to the live blogger and then they rewrite it and we effectively record the edits they've made and compare it to the original thing to kind of see what the distance is. But that just felt totally impossible in a practical way because you could be dealing with 300 to 400 words, right? It's a lot, actually. So where we ended up was building, just through something called Streamlit, a very, very simple kind of evaluation process. And we boiled it down and we had to think a lot about what the things we were measuring were, right? And we allowed the evaluators to do two things. First of all, generally, does it read in the style of a Guardian live blogger? right? Because that's radically different from how you would write an article. But secondly, we allowed them to evaluate each separate point of the summary in 3 ways. First of all, to say it's inaccurate. There's something fundamentally wrong with this bullet point. Secondly, it's accurate, but it's not actually important enough to be in a summary from the last 4 hours. And in some ways, that's the crucial thing that we were trying to teach the machine, right? In some ways, what we were trying to teach it was news sense. Because it wasn't summarizing an article with a pyramid of news where there are so many significant signifiers of what is important. It was attempting to pick out the most important things from a reverse chronological list of events. That's a radically different challenge. And the final thing, of course, they could say is it is absolutely accurate and also it's important enough to be there. That took a hell of a lot of work just to get there.
How long did it take?
I mean, it was probably weeks before we really landed on what we thought was the appropriate kind of framework for that, right? And the technical challenge of that wasn't so hard, right? But just the idea of taking it from that first very open evaluation down to something much more focused. And the other thing, of course, was we knew we were going to have to evaluate hundreds of these things. So we were going to have to hand a system out where individuals could compare the original historical version of the summary from the human against the machine-written one. And, you know, I can't stop all our live bloggers from writing just to ask them to do that for me for 5 weeks. So then you have to scrabble around and find people who are open enough, interested enough, and also expert enough, but probably aren't the people actually doing that thing. So it was a really significant lift.
Rubina, how did it work for the example you presented?
So we are now working on something called Echo 2.0, and specifically Zui Wen, who came up with the idea, is kind of thinking about how it is that you create, quantitative metrics for something that is really qualitative, which is editorial judgment, right? The most important thing is publication readiness. Like, how close can you get a summary to something that a journalist might actually write? And of course, we do edit 100% of AI drafted copy, regardless of what it is. That is a requirement. But we did want to get it to be closer to something that we would actually publish. And that is very difficult to do, in part because without fine-tuning, the outputs are often quite mediocre. And the reason for that is that these models are not trained on high-quality journalism, and that's it. They're trained on a lot of kind of mediocre work, and so they produce mediocre outputs. And so we thought to ourselves, okay, how do we get these closer to what the Times would actually conceivably have an editor write? And that was a difficult question to answer, because even 2 editors sitting next to each other could have different opinions about what it is that makes a summary good, right? And we found this because we sat down with some of our best editors and we had them evaluate a line editing test. So this is a test that we give to prospective editors who are applying for jobs at the Times. They basically have a list of sentences that they have to edit themselves. And we decided to give this test to large language models, a couple of different models, and to some journalists within the newsroom. And then we made it a blind test, and we had other editors evaluate the results. So they did not know which ones had been done by large language models and which ones had been done by editors that were, their colleagues. And so that was what was really interesting about that process, was that the editors that evaluated it didn't always agree with each other. And so that was the biggest challenge. It's like you have to kind of parse exactly what it is that makes a piece good by figuring out where the consensus is. And listening in to them discussing each individual sentence and why they evaluated the way they did, why they graded it that way, was actually very helpful for us in terms of figuring out that question about quality, right? And so this is an iterative process. It's basically trying to figure out, how can we do this for every single type of summary? So we worked very closely with the team from The Morning, which is a newsletter that the Times puts out every day. That's kind of a digest of what we've published, along with a longer description. And we did a similar kind of test with them, where we had summaries, like 1-sentence bullets, summaries of each article that they might have run, and we had them put out by 2 different models. And again, they didn't know which model was which, and so they had to choose which of those summaries was stronger. And then they couldn't be influenced by their own bias. And that is part of the process of trying to get to where we could help them create one-sentence summaries that were more helpful. We also spent a lot of time talking to them about what is it that makes something good. And a lot of times editors can't articulate. They're just like, this is mediocre, we would never use this, this isn't very good. And so we had to get really specific and figure out what is their list? What are their requirements? And for example, it might be that they don't want to include any jargon. They don't want to include acronyms that people might not be familiar with. They don't want to include long sentences that have 3 or 4 commas and are just impossible to parse. So we got down to really specifically, what is it that makes it good? And I think that's been an incredibly valuable process for us to try to figure out how to evaluate those qualitative aspects of editing, which is really hard to do.
Just brief follow-up. How often did the sort of testers notice that it was actually AI generated, or did they not?
They didn't know. I mean, they knew that some of them were AI generated and some of them weren't, but they didn't know which was which, because we didn't want them to be influenced.
And they couldn't sort of guess, did you ask them afterwards if they had sort of an inkling?
They couldn't guess.
Fun. Tess, you're next.
I think this is really interesting that there's 2 phases of evaluation here. It's both our internal evaluation of whether or not we think these products are live or good enough and ready to go live onto our site. And then second is the evaluation of whether our audiences find them useful and meaningful at all. And so we've done exactly, I think, what Chris and Rubina are talking about as well, which is the tech is easy. The tech team went off, these companies provide APIs, they can plug it in really fast, it's pretty easy, it's pretty cheap, nothing new for them. But what's new is the newsroom is in the workflow. The newsroom are responsible, I think is what I'm hearing from your newsrooms as well, for saying this is a quality output that passes our editorial standards, and so we think it's okay to go live on the site. And I think that's quite new for product development. Maybe someone checks a box and says, sure, it looks good, that sidebar, that module, great, it can go out the door. But this is does it spit out text that passes quality standards, that passes the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the Guardian standards? That is absolutely new development workflow. It is a very high set of responsibilities, and the newsroom is busy. We are not used to this kind of workflow. But then ultimately, once we did pass all of those evaluations, then we set it up just like an A/B test. It goes out to the audience. We define a number of metric endpoints. Do people spend more time with stories that have these summary bullets? Do they spend more time in their session? Do they read more articles? We set it up and then wait and see if it reaches statistical significance to see if there's really even any point to put these on our stories. For the text bot, maybe if I can just pivot to how we evaluate that before we think it's ready to go out the door for our audiences, it's really kind of a different thing. The question there is it going to put out something crazy? This is the first thing that all of your readers are going to do for your chatbot, is they're going to try and break it. They're going to try and get it to say something insane and take a screenshot and say, look, wow, the Wall Street Journal is, quote, unquote, saying X, Y, Z. And so we set up a group of red team testers to try and look for factual inaccuracies, to look for harmful content, or to look and evaluate whether it was just going off topic and not being useful at all. So these were tax experts who could really say, is this spitting out inaccurate or harmful content? They had to pass those tests before we went forward.
How easy was it for them to break it?
So this is what's really interesting, is this was our second chatbot in 6 months, and the RAG models are getting so good that we were really impressed. It was actually much easier this time around to keep the model on topic, to keep it pertinent, and to have it pull back relevant sources from our own reporting, as well as the tax documentation as well.
Can I just have a brief show of hands? How many people in the room actually know what a RAG model is? Okay, so about half. Can you just briefly, you're the sort of tech expert, can you briefly explain what it is
Yeah, so essentially you're going to load a database of content into the chatbot's brain, more or less. And so what the model is going to do is it's going to read and ingest and create kind of a network of all of the materials that it understands. And so when you ask a question about the child tax care credit, the model will retrieve a piece of information from that network and actually cite its source. It says specifically, this is the relevant piece of information that answers that question.
Amazing, thank you. I think one thing I found really interesting in all of your responses is sort of there's no one way to do it. It really depends on the application, it depends on the example, and the thing you want to try. It's also interesting, like, I should have introduced myself. I'm a scientist. I work at Oxford University. And when I sort of hear this in many ways, it strikes me as almost a scientific approach. You sort of have a hypothesis, you have some expectations of what you're going to find. You try to come up with an idea of what right, correct, good looks like, and then you sort of apply it to the process just in a different context, but it's effectively, to me, the same. One thing I was sort of wondering when I heard those stories is there some sort of database where you keep track of those different evaluations for the different applications you have within your organizations? And how do you assess this over time? So, of course, you can do it once before you deploy, but of course, the question is also, do you regularly sort of retest as these things go live, as these things maybe also change because models adapt and you maybe have different priorities?
I'll hop in here because we're going through this right at the moment. Our summary bullet points are live on our site, but the model is reaching its end of life. So we need to iterate and we need to deploy a new upgraded version of this model. This is really familiar. If there are machine learning engineers or data scientists in the room, you know that you need to think about this ahead of time. But this is a little bit new, so I don't think that our newsroom or that our product people were quite ready to now have a machine learning model in production that they need to regularly monitor its accuracy. Is it drifting over time? Okay, we need to swap in a new model. How are we going to come back to that very expensive and time-consuming round of evaluations? How do we store, to your point, do we store the answers that we got previously so that we can do a sort of automated test before bringing in humans back and doing the final check? We unfortunately have not done that yet, but we really need to. It's so time consuming.
Thank you. Rubina, Chris?
I mean, it kind of depends on which group it is we're working with. I'll talk a little bit about how we've been doing it with the morning team, which is probably the group we've worked with most closely over the past few months in terms of being able to evaluate the quality of the bullets, the newsletter bullets. And that is, we are planning to do kind of every 2 weeks, have a survey go out to them to evaluate the quality of the bullets. And I think the tricky part, anytime you're doing that with an internal team, is just making sure that it's not too onerous for them. Like, you never want it to feel like they're doing more work because of these tools. Like, you always want to make sure that they feel like they're saving time. And so in some cases, like, for example, with SEO headlines, we have a Slack channel where you can both test an SEO Slack bot, but can also provide feedback for it. And we're kind of frequently in there asking questions like, what are you guys seeing when you're using this? Is there any trend that you've noticed? And we will kind of adjust the prompt based on that. And it is really important to stay flexible. You know, you never want to feel like the people who are using these tools are hamstrung by AI or feel stuck because they keep getting outputs that are just not quite there. And you want to make sure that you're checking in with them regularly to make sure that it's as flexible as possible. That's incredibly important for us.
Is it okay to kind of go back to talk about why the live blog thing failed a little bit in terms of the results?
You're more than welcome. Be our guest.
Because I think it's kind of important. We obviously fine-tuned a series of different kind of models over the course of that period. And where we started from was really interesting, right? As in almost every single summary, you would see about half of the bullet points being marked as inaccurate, and often a quarter or more being marked as unimportant. By the time we got to the final kind of most refined model, that was significantly better. And you would be more consistently in the area of maybe one inaccuracy and maybe one not important enough. So we really, really improved it. It was a radical improvement from where we had started. But ultimately where we got to, it was less ultimately about the evaluation and more about something else. It was two things really. First of all, it's super hard to spot a single error in 400 words when you are live blogging and be really confident that you're going to catch it. So in some ways, the improvement of the model didn't help that much, right, in terms of efficiency. And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that providing the live bloggers with this was not as efficient as them writing it at this point. Now, again, to be clear, this is 18 months ago, right? So there's a whole series of different technologies that you might use now to do this. But the other thing that really bothered me about it was through that evaluation process, I came to realize that I was using a process that was inappropriate to actually train the thing what I was hoping to teach it. We gave it 3,700 examples of good summaries. And I guess what we were trying to teach it was good news judgment, right? How do you pick out the most important thing? And of course, every journalist does have a sense of that. But that is also rooted in a real world context where they can be damn sure of what feels like the most important thing. Now, what really boggled my mind was the machines definitely got more of a sense of news judgment, but it's ersatz, right? It's not deciding that, I don't know, Donald Trump's wig blowing off is important because, you know, lots of people talk about him having a wig and not so much else was happening on that day. It's just kind of picking it on a kind of vibesy kind of basis. And ultimately, that was the thing that worried me most about it. It looked like chicken, but maybe it tasted like fish, right? Maybe it was something, doing something different that was unpredictable and difficult to kind of gauge at scale. So that's ultimately why we didn't go ahead with it at that point.
Fantastic, thank you. For the sort of next block, and before we go to the audience Q&A, we've learned a lot already. Like we know, for instance, you need time to do these things. You also need buy-in from different parts of the organization, not just from editorial. You need it from business, from the tech team. You need to bring all these people together. Quite often they're sort of siloed. That's hard. And you have to do all these things while sort of keeping the show on the road. It's not something where you can, well, in the old days you would have said stop the printing presses. These days probably sort of plug out the cable from the server and stop printing. But basically you have to do all these things while the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Guardian have to keep on running. What would be your sort of main point of advice to other organizations, and also sort of thinking maybe about the things from a team perspective? How do you sort of manage those transitions and those processes?
I'm very happy we have a workflow editor because I think they were essential to operationalizing our summary bullets and any other piece of generative AI that goes into our journalism, because we require a human in the loop. And so there's a lot of training and there's new components of workflows that we have to think through really carefully. That's the value of just doing one of these projects end to end, is that you get to think about evaluation, audience perspective, as well as your workflow internally as well. We had to go through, I think, sort of the same sets of problems of this summary is factually correct, but it doesn't quite read right. That might not be something that we're super proud of to put on the site. Or this is a sensitive story, and we need to edit this really line by line and word by word to make sure we aren't in any kind of legal challenge. So I think we had to train everyone on this new piece of the workflow, which is, again, it's not no free lunch.
So Tess alluded to one of the things that I think is incredibly important, which is that we talk a lot about human in the loop or expert in the loop when we are referring to AI, but what's equally important is having a human in the process, or many humans in the process, early on, and they should be journalists. And that is something that is new in the product space in some cases, but it's also just so important to bring people in before you start to work on something, and also to make sure that it's something that they're asking for. We don't go to people and say, hey, we're really interested in this project because we're interested in it, or our leadership is interested in it. We really listen to them. We listen more than we talk, and we want to know what their frustrations are and how we can help them. And if you help people like that, you can get a lot more buy-in in the newsroom because you're literally solving their problem, right? Like, you're not just imposing yourself on them. And we don't force people to use AI. We really welcome them talking to us about how it could be helpful. And then the other part is, I talk about this, I teach a few workshops at CUNY, and I always talk about tiny experiments as a concept. This is something I would really encourage everyone to adopt, which is that you want to start really, really small. Like an experiment that you could finish in a few days, a few weeks, maybe a few months at absolute most. And the reason you want to take on something small and controlled and short is that then you can get buy-in, if it's successful, to run much larger experiments. I would never recommend you go out and say to your newsroom of hundreds of people, we are now going to start doing this, unless you start with 5 people, or you start with 10 people. And just see how it goes for a little while. So this is entirely how we operate in terms of the way that I like to work with journalists, is that I will identify the people who are really excited about this on individual desks, and I will start talking to them about it, and they will get the buy-in of others on that desk, and then we'll work with them to come up with a tiny experiment that we can start to just like make the case for the bigger one.
Probably also makes it easier for them sort of in a small scale environment to see, here's how I would personally think about what evaluation looks like before you sort of start deploying that at scale, where you probably have very different, sometimes competing priorities that you're trying to optimize for.
That's absolutely right.
In some ways, I'm becoming convinced that there are 2 things that are more important than just what we build in this kind of situation right now. And I think the first one is education about how these things work, right? Really boring, but super important, because I don't think newsrooms are informed enough at the most basic level about what ChatGPT does and the fact that it's probabilistic when it responds to you. And there is just a fundamental building block here of trying to elucidate those things really clearly, so that a journalist, when they ask a question of an open LLM, is asking a question in a way that's going to get them a decent answer. And also in getting them to think more clearly about the idea that you want to work with this thing, or adversarially, what you're not trying to do is produce the final proof, right? The shortcut. So we're focusing a lot on that at the moment, and I think there are various tools out there which can massively help journalists understand the value of these things. Notebook LM, to me, is such a fantastic and obvious boon to any journalist working with any documents. And crucially, of course, the reason I love Notebook LM is because it's one of the few products that is actively attempting to mitigate the fundamental problem of unreliability, right? Everyone talks about the podcast, right? I'd be very happy if those 2 AI podcasters were shot into the sun right now. I never want to hear from them again.
That is so interesting.
Yeah. But I love the very unsexy bit of it, the citation and the immediate opening of the PDF and the relevant bit for the journalist to go, does that stand up? Is it actually accurate? Once you've shown a journalist that and they've got something out of it, actually it illuminates a huge amount of the more complex things that we are talking about.
Thank you. I'll ask you all one final question before we go to the audience. What's the one thing people outside, but also maybe inside your respective organizations, get wrong about AI in the news?
Is it me first?
If you want to.
Okay, I'm quite obsessed with this at the moment. I'm super worried in 2 years' time, right? Everything's going to be intermediated at most fundamentally the device level, but also at the platform level. You look at AI overviews, right? People are going to pick up their iPhone and it's going to say, it's 8 a.m., Chris, here's the news. Tiny little disclaimer at the bottom saying it might be inaccurate. And that will be good enough for a lot of people. So what I'm interested in is, I don't really want to, I want us not to build the same thing. Right? What we are going to have to look for are the things that we do have that the platforms or the devices don't. So they have 2 major advantages. They have access probably to the entirety of the internet, not just our content. And they also have a hell of a lot of personal data so that they can personalize those things. So if we don't have those advantages, what is the product that we build that is built upon things that are unique to us? And that's the thing that's worrying me. And it's not just about how we use AI to respond to that, although I'm absolutely certain AI will be a part of it. But fundamentally, it's an old conversation, but it's more urgent than ever. Why should somebody, having been provided with that summary at their device level, why should they then come to us? Right? That's a very big question, but I think we really need to focus on it and worry about that as the focus of the products that we build.
Thank you.
So I think there's a very common misconception among the audience, but also occasionally you'll hear it from journalists, which surprises me, that that the way that people are using AI in newsrooms is to write articles, and that's just not really true of most of them. Like whenever I talk to someone in my neighborhood about my job, they look kind of worried, and they're like, "Oh, you're using AI for your art to write your articles," and it's just not the case, and it's not even like a use case that we seriously consider for journalists at the Guardian, the Journal, at the Times. We're very happy with the journalists that we hire, and so why would we diminish our product by just generating information using AI? It just doesn't make much sense to me. It's honestly like the great journalists that work for us are the competitive advantage that we have. And the other thing I think that kind of is in line with that is that there are probably 50 of us in the world who do this work, AI in newsrooms, right? You're seeing 4 of them up here, and you've seen many of them at the other panels. And all of us are pretty obsessed with the ethical implications of doing this and having high editorial standards for what we're producing. And I've had so many conversations with these journalists around the world, or gone to conferences focused on the ethics around AI. And I don't think that our audience or even other journalists fully appreciate how much time we spend thinking about this. Like it is actually a very fundamental part of the job that you're able to hold high ethical and editorial standards and respect transparency as part of that. And so I think if I had to tell, the audience or other journalists, the one thing about AI news that maybe you get wrong is that we don't use it to write articles, at least we don't, and also that we really are pretty obsessed with the editorial and ethical implications of doing it.
Which is, I guess, part of why we had this panel. I mean, we could have been talking about how the New York Times uses toasters, but actually what we tried to draw out was basically what goes on behind the scenes apart from sort of technology itself and the thinking. Tess, what's your view on the things that people get wrong?
I'll tack on to what Chris mentioned earlier, which is that we're at a moment where the newsrooms many journalists don't yet understand or leverage AI to the extent that they could and potentially should to help their reporting. I think that many folks thought that AI was going to be this massive democratization of investigative and data journalism tools. And I don't think we're seeing that yet. I think what we're seeing are very, very talented data journalists, people who already knew how to code, who already knew how to go out and process massive amounts of data and tell a fantastic story. Those, let's call them 10x engineers, they just became 1,000x engineers, and they are off to the races and doing insane, amazing things. One of them, Brian Witten, built the text bot. So that's just an example. I think then there's another 10% of your newsroom who have their head in the sand and who have told us in surveys that, like, how can we stop its advance? They do not want to work with AI. They do not want to use AI at all. And then there's this group in the middle who are not yet seeing the opportunity, they're not yet seizing it, and I think that's our challenge, is to really figure out how we can bring them along on the journey and make their talents even more applicable in this age.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got about 6 actually minutes left for questions, so show of hands, and then I will basically take these two together, so keep it very short, no comments, no I'm this and this person, just a question. So this gentleman, and then Ulrike, and then these two gentlemen over there, and then this woman.
What skills would you recommend a young journalist to have in the age of AI? What skills would I need to have to survive in the next decade?
Thank you.
When you build these products, a tax bot or a live blogging bot, do you strive to develop the best product for that particular situation, the best it could possibly be, or do you immediately aim to scale it so be as useful as possible in many different similar use cases?
Thank you. And quick answers from my panelists before we go to the next people.
Curiosity and a willingness to try it, and also to let yourself off the hook if you don't want to use it. It's okay. In terms of scaling the products, the one I was describing, really the ultimate aim of that was actually to understand fine-tuning more than anything else, right? But I think your question is a really good one. I think many of us have started with very narrow use cases, partly to sidestep some of the very big challenges around unreliability. So to be quite frank, the scalability aspect is more along the lines of what Rubina was describing. I showed our version of that a couple of years ago called Guillemot, where you're building a tool which makes it easy for people to execute a whole series of different prompts on a given article. It's that kind of scalability that I think we've been thinking about a bit more rather than massive scaling up to readers.
Yeah, to the question about what you need in the next few years or the next 10 years is honestly just flexibility and openness and an obsessive desire to want to learn as much as you possibly can. And so I think that's the number one thing. I mean, I've been working in digital journalism for a long time and had many kind of sub-careers as part of that. I started as a reporter, and that's not at all what I do now. And so I think as long as you maintain that, you will be just fine. And then as for scalability, I do think that we do try to put out a product that we actually, whenever we're thinking about prototyping, we have no-goes as part of that, like things that we're not going to worry about right now, but will worry about later. And so we do try to create something quickly that we can test out and then iterate on.
I think it's a passion to super serve your audience. That's going to be what allows journalism to continue to survive. In terms of scalability, we started with very precise focused tools, but now we are trying to build a platform for everything else that's going to plug into our CMS so that we can scale and move more quickly.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try to get another 2-3 questions in. The lady with the brown jacket, please, and the gentleman over there. Yep, go ahead.
Do any of you have a concrete example of use of AI in an investigation where you did find that needle in the haystack that you wouldn't have had you not used AI?
Thank you.
Could you talk about transparency with audience? Like, how do you show them how these tools are being used, assuming that you're doing that?
I think we had one final question maybe in the front here, and then everyone else can ask the panelists afterwards. But
how do you feel with the speed of technology improvement, and what news sources or blogs could you recommend to keep on it?
All right, off you go.
I will answer a couple of these. So the investigative journalism example I think that hits home with a lot of people is that we used AI for the confirmation hearings. So for Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth, for example, they are both on TV a lot. You know, Pete Hegseth used to have a show on Fox and Friends, and so we had thousands of hours of videos to work with of his appearances, and Tulsi Gabbard as well. She's constantly on TV on many different channels, and so we were able to use the Internet Archive to get access to these videos, and then transcribe what they had said to try to compare them to what their political positions were now. And also, you know, in Pete Hegseth's case, there were many times that he alluded to drinking on Fox and Friends, for example, and his drinking was a major issue in the confirmation hearings. And it isn't like when he's alluding to his drinking, he's saying things like, "I consumed alcohol last night." No, he's going to use very different language than that. Like, he might use the term blitzed, he might be referring to Hendrick's gin. And what we were able to do was we were able to use semantic search, so not keyword-based search, but searching by meaning to figure out when he was talking about alcohol, even if it wasn't obvious. And so, you know, you're using AI to transcribe all of these videos, and then you're using it to search all of the videos for the most relevant information so that you can share that with your audience. Similarly with Tulsi Gabbard, we had to actually use like a facial recognition model by like clustering images of her, so it could recognize her on all of these different channels and figure out when it was that she was talking specifically, because it's not the same as Pete, where you can just have all of the Fox and Friends appearances, and then we could search for what she said about Russia and about Syria, and that was incredibly important as well. And then I had there was a question about blogs and newsletters. Nikita Roy is here. If you have not listened to the Newsroom Robots podcast, please do. That is how I learned a lot for my job, and it's actually just as good as attending panels. I also really recommend the One Useful Thing newsletter by Ethan Mollick and his book Co-Intelligence.
Fortunately, I have to cut you off
Sorry,
there.
and the Axios AI Plus newsletter. Okay, that's my normal one.
But anyway, shout out to Nikita and the newsletter. Thank you so much to you all for your questions. Hopefully you can ask them afterwards. Thanks to my panelists, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the day.